My name is Hannah Carter. I'm 32 years old, and the night my mother told me to stay in the back because the important people were arriving, I nodded and walked down the hallway and did exactly what she said. 20 minutes later, a black SUV pulled into the driveway. The guest my father had spent 6 months trying to impress walked through the front door, looked around the room, and asked one question: "Where is Hannah?" I have never seen my father's face do what it did in that moment. Not in 32 years of watching it perform confidence in rooms he had decided mattered. But this story does not start at the party. It starts at a dinner table when I was 9 years old, carrying a breadbasket into a room I was allowed to enter only long enough to set something down. I want to tell you about the night I finally stopped going back to the kitchen, and about the person who walked through my father's front door and undid 32 years of that in about 4 minutes. If someone has ever told you to make yourself smaller so the important people wouldn't have to see you, this one is yours. Welcome back to Revenge Cold Stories. Drop your first name and your city in the comments and subscribe before we go any further. Now let me take you back to before the party. There is a bound report on my desk, 87 pages, dark blue cover, the initials RHEI embossed in the bottom right corner. It is the 5-year outcomes study from a maternal healthcare access program I built and ran across 4 states. Last year it was published in a national health journal. In September it was cited in congressional testimony about rural maternal mortality rates. I look at that report sometimes when I need to remember what I actually am. Not what my family thinks I am. What I am. I work as a program director at a nonprofit called the Rural Health Equity Initiative. We design intervention programs for underserved rural communities, build partnerships with state health departments, train community health workers, publish research that informs policy and funding decisions. 3 years ago, a model I developed was adopted by 2 state legislatures. The work is unglamorous and important and almost entirely invisible to people who measure value by the size of someone's business card. My mother's most recent description of it, delivered at a family dinner 4 months before the party, was, "Hannah does her little health projects." She said it with the mild warmth of someone describing a hobby. She said it while my brother Ethan was mid-explanation of a commercial real estate deal he was consulting on, the 3rd time he had described the same deal in as many weeks, a deal that had not yet closed, and that I would eventually learn never did. My father asked 2 follow-up questions about Ethan's deal. Nobody asked about the health projects. I finished my dinner without correcting her because I had stopped correcting her around year 26. The correction required more energy than the inaccuracy cost me, and I had understood for long enough that the gap between who I was and who my family believed I was had nothing to do with information. It was about attention. And attention, in the Carter household, had been allocated according to a hierarchy that was fully formed by the time I was 9 years old, carrying warm rolls into a room that was not expecting me to stay. That dinner when I was 9, I need to show it to you properly because it is the whole architecture of what came 32 years later. My father had his business partners over on a Friday evening. I remember the specific weight of the breadbasket, heavy ceramic, warm from the oven, a dish towel folded over the top to hold the heat in. My mother handed it to me in the kitchen doorway with the ease of someone assigning a task to the person who could always be assigned tasks without discussion. Take this out and then come back for the salad. I carried the basket into the dining room. My father was mid-sentence at the head of the table, the kind of sentence that had an audience and knew it, and he did not look at me when I set the basket down. 2 men I did not know watched me perform the task with the polite non-attention adults give to children who are doing what children are supposed to do. I was walking back toward the kitchen when I heard his voice. "And this is my son Ethan." I turned. Ethan was 11, standing in the dining room doorway in the shirt my mother had ironed that afternoon, my father's hand on his shoulder. The 2 men at the table recalibrating their attention toward my brother with the body language of people being introduced to something they were expected to value. I stood in the hallway with the dish towel in my hands. Nobody said, "And this is Hannah." I went back to the kitchen. I have thought about that breadbasket many times since, not with the self-pity of a wound kept fresh by rehearsal. with the clarity of someone who has had 32 years to understand that the moment was not a mistake. It was a system operating correctly, and the system had been fully functional long before that Friday evening. My father's name is Richard Carter, 61. He grew up without much and built what he has through the accumulated intelligence of a man who understood early that visibility is currency. The right handshake at the right moment, the right association at the right time. He is not wrong about this framework for certain kinds of work in certain kinds of rooms. The problem is he applied it universally. In Richard's model, what cannot be seen cannot be valued. The guest list at a dinner party is an accurate map of what matters. His son's firm handshake and easy smile are assets worth cultivating. His daughter's research into maternal mortality rates in rural counties is, at best, a quiet side interest, and at worst, something that requires management so it does not complicate the family's image. He genuinely believed this, not from cruelty, from a coherent worldview that had worked well enough for 60 years that he had stopped examining its assumptions. He had spent 6 months building toward a meeting with Eleanor Brooks. Eleanor was 67, nationally recognized in public-private partnership development, selective about every room she entered, the kind of presence whose attendance at an event changes what the event means. My father wanted proximity to her because proximity was how his system worked. Find the person whose visibility confers visibility. Get close enough for the association to register. He did not know Eleanor Brooks had been reading my work for 2 years. He did not know because he had never paid enough attention to my work to produce a conversation that would have led anywhere near that information. My mother, Linda, is 58. She built the family's public image from the outside in, starting with the facade and working toward whatever interior the facade required. Her social circle, her church friendships, her neighborhood relationships, all of it rested on a version of the Carter family where Ethan was the success story and Hannah was the quiet one finding her way. Hannah's actual success would require Linda to revise a narrative she had been building for 30 years. The revision would be visible to everyone who had accepted the original version. That is a significant ask. It was an ask Linda was not prepared to receive. My brother Ethan is 34. He has my father's instinct for a room and my mother's ease at its center. He is not calculating. This took me a long time to understand clearly because the effect of his comfort looked so much like intention. He occupies the space that has always been prepared for him without examining who might be standing in the hallway behind him. Comfortable people rarely look behind them. There is no reason to. 3 days before the party, my mother came to my apartment. She sat at my kitchen table with the reasonable tone she used when she needed me to accept something that would not sound reasonable if stated directly. Tonight is important. These are your father's people. You would be uncomfortable anyway. It would be better if you stayed in the background. You know how these things go. Each sentence individually innocuous. Together, in sequence, a familiar pattern. I had been nodding at this sentence my entire life in different wordings. I walked her to the door, and when she left, I went to my desk and looked at the report. 87 pages, the number of people the program had reached. The letter from the woman in a rural county 3 states away whose pregnancy complication had been caught early because of the community health worker my program had trained. I kept the count in my head the way other people count their breathing. The night of the party, I arrived early and handled the setup because that was what I always did. Catering coordination, furniture arrangement, the operational logistics my mother had written on a list and handed to me with the ease of someone who has always known which person handles things without being asked. At 5:15, guests arriving at 6, she found me in the kitchen. "Stay in the back. The important people are arriving." She said it in front of 2 aunts and a cousin. One aunt nodded as if this was a reasonable logistical arrangement. The cousin looked at her phone. Ethan, passing through the doorway in his good suit, straightened his collar in the mirror by the door without looking at me. I said, "Okay." I went to the back hallway. I sat in the chair by the side window. The family group chat started filling almost immediately. Photographs of the decorated rooms, Ethan in his suit, my father greeting the first arrivals. The caption on the 4th photo read, "Proud of this family tonight." I counted 14 photos before I stopped counting. I was not in a single one, not because I had not been there, because nobody had pointed a camera in my direction. I was in the same house. My Aunt Sandra found me in the hallway around 7. She brought me a plate and sat beside me for a moment and said, "Don't take it personally. Your father just needs this to go well. You know how he gets." She meant it kindly. That is the thing about sentences like that. They are delivered with warmth. The warmth is the cruelty. The assumption that I should absorb this quietly, that my exclusion from my family's proudest evening is a minor logistical inconvenience rather than a verdict delivered in front of witnesses, wrapped in the suggestion that taking it personally would be the unreasonable response. Don't take it personally settled in my chest the way those sentences do, small and permanent. I texted my friend Camille a single message, same as always. Her reply came in 2 seconds. I did not describe to anyone what she wrote. The speed of it was the whole thing. I refilled the ice bucket twice because I heard someone ask for ice and nobody else moved. I stood near the kitchen door long enough to hear Ethan introduced to 3 different guests. His name said with pride, his future described as bright by my father to people he had spent 6 months trying to impress. Then I thought about Eleanor's email. 10 days earlier, a scheduling assistant had written to confirm whether I would be attending the Carter family event on Saturday. The email noted that Dr. Eleanor Brooks was looking forward to the opportunity to connect. I had assumed it was routine networking outreach and replied yes without mentioning it to my parents, partly because they had not mentioned Eleanor to me, and partly because I had long ago stopped expecting my professional life to produce conversations in this family. Standing near the kitchen door with the party running without me, the email snagged in a way it had not when I first read it. Why would Eleanor Brooks' scheduling assistant reach out to me? Why would Dr. Brooks be looking forward to connecting with Hannah when my father had presumably not listed me as anyone worth the introduction? The thought lodged. I did not chase it yet. Then the energy in the front of the house shifted. Not loudly. The way rooms shift when something has entered them that reorients everyone inside without announcing itself. I heard my father's voice at the front door, the performance version, and then a quality of attention moving through the house like a current changing direction. Then a pause, then a voice I did not recognize, clear, unhurried, carrying the specific authority of someone who does not need volume to be heard. "Where is Hannah?" The house went quiet in a way that houses go quiet when a question has arrived that nobody in the room knows how to answer. I stood in the hallway. I looked at the bread basket on the kitchen counter. Same basket. 32 years later. The only thing that had changed was what I was about to do with my hands. The voice asked the question once. It did not repeat itself. It did not soften into a social recovery or redirect toward my father, who was standing at the front door with the expression of a man whose prepared script has encountered a line he did not write. Eleanor Brooks looked around the room with the patient attention of someone who has spent 67 years in rooms and has developed an accurate instinct for whether the person she is looking for is present or has been arranged away. She had the kind of presence that does not announce itself because it does not need to. Rooms organize around it without being asked. My father said something. I could not hear the exact words from the hallway, but I heard the register of them, the performance register dropping into something less rehearsed, the sound of a man recalibrating in real time. Eleanor was not redirected by whatever he said. She looked around the room again and said clearly enough to reach me through the kitchen door that she had come because she had been told Hannah Carter would be here and that she had been trying to get Hannah in front of the foundation's board for 3 months. 3 months. The email from the scheduling assistant had arrived 10 days ago. The foundation had been trying to reach me for 3 months before that. The timeline sat in the hallway with me and assembled itself into something I had not previously understood. Eleanor Brooks had not accepted my father's dinner invitation because of my father. She had accepted it because her office had cross-referenced the guest list, found my name on it, and decided the event was worth attending. I was the reason she was in that house. My father had spent 6 months building toward a meeting with Eleanor Brooks, and the meeting had arrived through a door he had spent 32 years managing me away from. I stood in the hallway. I thought about the bread basket on the kitchen counter behind me. Then I walked out, not dramatically, not with the energy of someone who has been waiting for a moment and is now claiming it. I walked through the house the way I had been walking through it all evening, the way I had been walking through Carter family events since I was 17, and handling the logistics while other people handled the introductions. The difference was the direction. I had been moving toward the back all evening. Now I moved toward the front. I entered the living room. Eleanor saw me before I reached the center of the room, the way people see the person they came for, not by scanning but by recognition, the immediate identification of something they have been looking for that has just become visible. She crossed the room toward me, not toward my father, not toward the host, toward me. The handshake was the scene. I want to describe it plainly because the plainness is the point. It was a handshake between two professionals who had been corresponding for 3 months and were meeting for the first time. Eleanor's grip was firm, and her expression was the warm directness of someone who has been looking forward to a conversation and has finally arrived at its beginning. She said, "Hannah, I've been wanting to meet you for a very long time." My father was standing 2 feet to her left. He became background furniture. Eleanor and I moved to 2 chairs near the far window, not the main seating area, not the arrangement my mother had positioned for the evening's most important guest, but 2 chairs near the window where the noise of the party was present but not intrusive, and where a real conversation could happen without performing itself for the room. I want to be honest about what I felt in those first minutes, because the honest version is more interesting than the triumphant one. I felt the specific alertness of someone who has spent years in professional contexts that required full presence and has suddenly been handed a context that requires it in a room where nobody has ever required it of her before. Not vindication. Clarity. The sensation of the professional version of myself, the one that existed entirely outside this house, walking into a room where only the personal version had ever been permitted. Eleanor asked about the outcomes study first. She had read it twice, she said, which I understood as a professional statement rather than a compliment. Reading a policy research document twice meant engaging with the methodology and the data rather than the summary. She had questions about the community health worker training model and whether the intervention design could scale to a broader geographic scope without losing the relational quality that had produced the outcomes. These were not networking questions. They were the questions of someone who had done her homework and was now doing the work of deciding whether the collaboration she was considering was built on something real. I answered them the way I answered questions in professional contexts, directly and without the apologetic hedging I had spent 32 years deploying in family rooms where my directness had been described as difficult. My father appeared at the edge of the conversation twice in the first 15 minutes. The first time he stood nearby with the body language of a man waiting for an introduction that would allow him to enter the exchange. Eleanor did not look up. The second time he said her name, just her first name, in the tone he used when he was reminding a room of his presence. Eleanor glanced at him briefly with the polite acknowledgement of someone who has registered a sound and is returning to the conversation that interests her. He did not come back a third time. My Aunt Sandra found me during a brief pause in the conversation when Eleanor had stepped away to greet another guest she recognized across the room. Sandra came to where I was standing with the expression of someone who has revised something and wants to indicate the revision without fully describing it. She said, "I didn't realize you knew Eleanor Brooks." I said, "She found my research." Sandra said, "How long have you two been in contact?" I said, "A few months." She said, "Your father didn't know." It was not a question. It was Sandra absorbing a piece of information that required reorganizing several other pieces she had been holding. I said, "Nobody asked." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, with the careful tone of someone choosing words in real time, "I owe you an apology. What I said earlier, don't take it personally." I looked at Sandra. She was 64, my mother's older sister, a woman who had attended every Carter family event I could remember and had always occupied the middle position, not complicit in the worst of it, but not willing to pay the cost of naming it either. I said, "I know you meant it kindly." She said, "I did. That's why I'm apologizing." kindness that asks you to absorb something you shouldn't have to absorb isn't actually kindness. That was the most honest thing a member of my family had said to me in a very long time. I said, "Thank you, Sandra." Eleanor returned. Sandra stepped back. The conversation resumed. What happened in the room while Eleanor and I talked is something I reconstructed afterward from what I observed and what Camille told me, because Camille had arrived late and had the specific advantage of entering a party midstream without any investment in how it had been arranged. Camille was 33, a public policy attorney I had met at a conference 4 years earlier, and she was the friend I had texted from the hallway. She arrived at 8, an hour after Eleanor, and she read the room in approximately 90 seconds with the accuracy of someone who did not know the history and was therefore seeing it clearly. She told me afterward that the first thing she noticed was my father standing near the periphery of Eleanor's eye line rather than at its center, which was a reversal of every positioning instinct he had spent 60 years developing. She told me that Ethan had been introduced to 3 guests in the first hour, and that all 3 conversations had been brief and had not produced any visible follow-up engagement. She told me that my mother had spent most of the evening near the group closest to Eleanor and me and had said very little, which Camille described as the loudest silence she had observed at a social event in recent memory. She told me that several guests who had arrived knowing my father's name had left asking about mine. This was not something I arranged. It was simply what happened when the work was visible to people who could see it. Eleanor and I talked for an hour and 40 minutes. At some point, the conversation shifted from the outcome study to the Foundation's Rural Health Initiative, which she described in enough detail that I understood it was not a peripheral project, but a central strategic priority. The Foundation had been struggling with the same structural problem my program had addressed in its 3rd year, the gap between community trust and institutional intervention, and Eleanor had read our methodology as the closest available model for how that gap had been closed elsewhere. She said, "We want you on the board." She said it with the directness of someone who had made the decision before the evening began and was now completing the formality of offering. I said, "I'd want to understand the time commitment and the governance structure before I commit." Eleanor looked at me with an expression I recognized from professional contexts, the expression of someone who has just received a response that confirms what they had already assessed about a person. She said, "Good, that's the right answer." We agreed that her office would send the formal materials the following week. She stood to leave at 9:30 and said goodbye to several guests on her way to the door. She shook my father's hand. She said something to him that I could not hear from across the room, but that my father received with the expression of a man hearing something accurate about himself that he had not expected to be said aloud. At the door, Eleanor turned back once and looked at me. She nodded. I nodded back. Then she left. The party continued for another hour after Eleanor's departure with the specific deflation of an event that has passed its emotional peak and is now running on social habit and remaining wine. I moved through it differently than I had moved through the earlier part of the evening, not with performance, with the ease of someone who has stopped waiting for permission to be present. I talked to Camille for 20 minutes near the fireplace. I talked to one of my father's business associates who had read a piece in a health policy journal and recognized the research and wanted to discuss it. I ate something from the catering table, a real plate, and stood in the main room while I ate it. My mother watched me from across the room for most of that hour. She was performing her hosting duties with the sustained competence she brought to everything she managed, but underneath the competence was something I recognized as recalculation. The version of the family she had been presenting all evening had encountered a revision it had not accounted for, and the revision had happened in front of the social circle the version was designed to impress. She did not approach me during that hour. At 10:15, I picked up my bag. I said goodbye to Sandra, who squeezed my hand in a way that did not require a verbal explanation. I said goodbye to Camille, who said, "Call me tomorrow," in the tone she used when she had things to say that required a different room than the current one. I walked toward the front door. My father was standing near it. He looked at me with the expression I had been watching reconfigure itself all evening, from performance to confusion to something that had not yet resolved into whatever it was becoming. He opened his mouth. I passed him, and reached the door and put my hand on it. My mother had appeared at the edge of the hallway. I turned back slightly and said quietly, so it did not carry to the room behind her, "Next time you want to tell me where to stand, remember tonight." Not loudly, under 12 words. I did not wait for a response. I walked out through the front door of my father's house. Not the back hallway, the front door. The same door I had used 100 times before. The difference was that I walked through it while the room was still full, while the guests were still present, while my father stood beside it and said nothing, because there was nothing available to him to say. I drove home. I thought about the breadbasket. I thought about Eleanor's handshake. I thought about a 9-year-old in a hallway with a dish towel in her hands, learning a system she would spend the next 32 years quietly building her way out of. The front door closed behind me. The board materials arrived on Thursday, a formal packet from Eleanor's foundation, sent through her office with the specific organization of an institution that takes its governance seriously. Cover letter, board member responsibilities, meeting schedule, the foundation's strategic plan for the Rural Health Initiative, and a 1-page summary of what the board position would require from me in terms of time and engagement. I read everything twice. Then I called Eleanor's office and asked 3 questions about the governance structure that the packet had not fully addressed. Her assistant said she would pass them along. Eleanor called back herself within the hour, which told me something about how she operated that the formal materials had not. We talked for 20 minutes. I accepted the position at the end of the call. I sat at my desk afterward with the packet and the bound reports side by side. The report that had been on my desk for 2 years, the one I looked at when I needed to remember what I was, and now a letter from Eleanor's foundation confirming a board appointment that had come directly from that work. I did not frame the letter. I set it next to the report and went back to the 3 emails that had accumulated while I was on the phone. I had somewhere to be. My father called 2 weeks after the party, not the morning after, not the day after. 2 weeks, which told me he had spent the intervening time in the specific internal negotiation of a man who needs to make contact but has not yet located the version of the contact that allows him to maintain his understanding of himself. He called on a Tuesday evening. He did not apologize directly. What he said was that he had no idea Eleanor knew my work, and that if he had known, he would have introduced them differently. He said it with the careful phrasing of someone who has rehearsed a sentence until it says the true thing without fully saying it. I listened. Then I said, "I know." He said, "I would have." I said, "Dad, I know you would have. That's the whole problem." A silence. He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "You would have introduced us if you had known Eleanor valued my work. The question you are not asking is why you did not know. You did not know because you have never paid enough attention to what I do to have found out. And that is not Eleanor's gap or mine. It is yours." The line was quiet for a long time. He said, "That's fair." He said it in the tone of a man who has not frequently said that phrase to his daughter and is discovering that saying it is both simpler and harder than he anticipated. I said, "I am not angry, Dad. I want to be clear about that. I am not calling from a place of anger." He said, "What are you calling from?" I said, "You called me." He made a sound that was almost a laugh, not the performance laugh, something smaller and more honest. He said, "I didn't know about any of it, the congressional testimony, the journal publication, the foundation. I didn't know." I said, "I know you didn't." He said, "You never told us." I said, "I tried. For about 10 years I tried, and then I stopped trying because the trying cost more than the silence." He was quiet again. Then he said, "I want to understand it now, what you do. I want to actually understand it." I thought about that sentence for a moment. Not cynically, honestly, measuring whether it was the sentence of a man who had arrived somewhere real or the sentence of a man managing a situation that had revealed itself as more significant than he had expected. I said, "And then ask me about it, not tonight, when you are ready to actually listen rather than to be seen listening." He said, "How will you know the difference?" I said, "I'll know." He said, "Okay." The call ended. I did not call back. But I left the door at its current position, which was not closed and was not open, just present, the way a door is when someone has not yet decided whether to walk through it and you have decided that the decision is theirs to make. My mother called 3 days after my father. Her call had a different quality. Where my father's had been the negotiation of a man working toward an honest admission, my mother's was the call of a woman managing the consequences of an event that had not gone the way her management had intended. She said the party had gone well overall. I let that sit for a moment. She said Eleanor had been an impressive presence. I agreed. She said some of the guests had asked about me afterward. I said I imagined they had. She said, and this was the sentence she had been building toward, that perhaps she had been too cautious about the guest management, and that in retrospect it might have been better to have me more visible during the evening. Guest management, she had told me to stay in the back because the important people were arriving, and now she was describing it as guest management. I said, Mom, you told me the important people were arriving and that I would embarrass everyone. You said it in front of Sandra and 2 other relatives. Ethan fixed his collar in the mirror while you said it. She said, I was nervous about the evening. I said, I know you were, and I understand that your nervousness comes from a real place. But what you said was not about the evening. It was about me, and it was not the first time. She said, you've always been so sensitive. There it was, the sentence that had been waiting its whole life to arrive, the reclassification of a response to real treatment as a character flaw in the person who received it. I said, I've been clear. There is a difference. She said nothing. I said, I am not ending this relationship, Mom, but I am also not going to pretend that what happened at that party was a logistical arrangement that could have gone differently with better planning. It was 32 years of a pattern, and the party was just the evening where the pattern had a witness. She said, Eleanor. I said, everyone in that room. The line was quiet. She said, I don't know how to fix it. I said, I know, but acknowledging that the thing exists is the first part of knowing how. She said she would think about it. I said that was a start. Ethan texted, rather than called. 4 days after the party, a single message that said, heard the party went well for you. No punctuation, no follow-up. I read it twice, trying to locate the register. Not sarcastic, not warm. The message of someone who has received information that required a response and has produced the smallest response available. I wrote back. It did. He did not reply. 3 weeks later, he texted again. This time, he asked if I could look at a business proposal he was developing. He said he had been thinking about pivoting from real estate consulting to a different sector and wanted a second opinion from someone who understood nonprofit structures. I sat with that for a moment. Ethan asking me for professional input was not something that had happened in 32 years of being his sister. The ask was awkward in the way that asks are awkward when someone is crossing a threshold they have not previously approached and is not entirely sure of the footing. I wrote back and said, send it over. Not because the party had resolved everything between us. It had not. Ethan's consequence was not a dramatic reckoning or a moment of public correction. It was quieter and in some ways more permanent. He had been in a room that had found something more interesting than what he was offering, and the room had not been cruel about it, had simply reorganized around a different center. That kind of consequence does not produce a speech. It produces a slow reassessment that happens privately and takes longer than any single evening to complete. The proposal he sent was not bad. I gave him 2 hours of honest feedback and told him 3 things that needed reworking before it was ready to present to anyone. He wrote back thank you and nothing else. It was a start. Sandra called the week after the party, not the apologetic call she had partially made at the party itself. A real call, the kind that requires more than a moment between other things. She said she had been thinking about what she had said at the party and what I had said in return, and that she wanted to understand something. She said, how long has this been happening? The work, the recognition, all of it. How long have we all been not knowing? I said, the program has been running for 6 years. The outcome study published last year, the congressional citation was in September. She said, 6 years. I said, yes. She said, and none of us knew. I said, Sandra, nobody asked. She said, I'm asking now. So I told her, not defensively, not with the weight of 32 years of accumulated hurt shaping the telling into something that needed to perform its own importance, just plainly. The program how it worked, what it had produced, the people it had reached in rural counties where access to maternal health care had been structurally inadequate for decades. Sandra listened for 40 minutes without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Your grandmother would have understood what you do immediately. She was a practical woman. She understood that the unglamorous work was usually the most important work." I said, "I know. I think about her sometimes when the work is hard." Sandra said, "She would have been proud." I said, "I know that too." We talked for another 20 minutes about things that had nothing to do with the party or my father or my mother's guest management. We talked about Sandra's garden and a trip she was planning and a book we had both read years apart and remembered differently. It was the most ordinary conversation I had ever had with a member of my family. Ordinary, it turned out, was what I had been waiting for. 6 weeks after the party, I attended my first board meeting at Eleanor's foundation. The foundation's offices were in a building downtown with the specific quality of an institution that has been doing serious work for long enough that seriousness has become ambient. The boardroom was plain and well lit, and the people around the table had been introduced to each other's work long before they were introduced to each other. Eleanor opened the meeting. She said, "Before we begin, I want to formally welcome Hannah Carter to the board. Those of you who have read the Rural Health Outcomes Study will understand why we pursued this appointment. Those of you who haven't, I'd recommend doing so before next quarter." Several people around the table nodded. One of them, a woman I recognized from a policy conference I had attended the previous year, looked at me and said, "The training model in the third section. I've been trying to replicate it for 18 months. I have questions." I said, "I have time after the meeting." The meeting began. I sat at the table and contributed to a conversation about public health infrastructure with the ease of someone who has been doing this work for 6 years and has finally been invited into a room that knows what the work is worth. It felt ordinary, the good kind. My family spent 32 years managing what the important people would see when they looked at us. My mother told me to stay in the back at my father's party because the important people were arriving. I stayed in the back. Eleanor Brooks arrived, looked around the room, and asked where I was. She had come because of my work and had been trying to reach me for 3 months before the party provided the occasion. I walked out of the hallway and into the room, and Eleanor crossed toward me and not toward my father. My father became background furniture for the rest of the evening. I accepted a board position. My father called 2 weeks later and said he did not know. My mother called and described the evening as guest management. Ethan texted and then asked for professional feedback. Sandra called and listened for 40 minutes. I attended my first board meeting and someone had questions about the training model. That is the whole story. Now here is what I want to leave with you. The breadbasket is a system, not a single moment of cruelty. A system that runs on the assumption that certain people carry things and certain people get introduced, and the distinction between them is fixed and permanent and not worth examining. The breadbasket at 9 years old, the back hallway at 32, the same system, 32 years apart, running so smoothly nobody in the house thought to look at it. Systems like that only become visible when something from outside the system arrives and asks a question the system cannot answer. Eleanor's question was 4 words. Where is Hannah? The system had no response to that question because the system had never built one. It had never needed to. I had been staying in the back for long enough that the possibility of someone coming looking had not been planned for. Real, important people do not look at the performance. They look for the work, and the work does not stay in the back. It gets found, eventually, by the people whose job it is to find it. You do not need to announce yourself. You need to build the thing. The right room will come looking. Tell me in the comments your first name and your city. Tell me if you have ever been the person in the hallway while the room introduced everyone else. Tell me if someone came looking anyway. For more stories like this one, come find us on the channel. Every story here is about someone who was told to make themselves smaller and decided instead to keep building. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.